Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, with many countries recording their highest ever temperatures of over 40 degrees Celsius, the summer of 2022 has witnessed the worst heat wave in decades. What challenges is the planet facing, and what does this extreme weather tell us about global warming? India's Prime Minister sets the national goal of transforming the country into a developed nation. What are the challenges ahead? What should India do to achieve its goals? Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qianduo. China recently witnessed the strongest regional heat wave since 1961, when the country first started keeping complete meteorological records. China is not alone, as Europe also suffers from heat waves and the worst drought in 500 years. So what's behind the high temperatures, and what does this summer's worldwide extreme heat tell us about the global climate? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined today by Charles Liu, founder of Hall Capital and Senior Fellow at Taihe Institute, Harvey Zoldan, Senior Fellow of the Center for China and Globalization, and Wu Changhua, Executive Director of a Professional Association of China's Environment. Well, Changhua, I will start with you. First, tell us what are the causes for this unusual extreme heat in China and other parts of the world, like European countries and also western part of the U.S., northern Mexico, etc.
Well, climate is changing, and the planet is burning, is on fire. And the heat waves, are one of the clearest consequences of climate change. For this round or episode of China's extreme heat waves, the scientific explanation is that heat domes formed by abnormal atmospheric circulation or high pressure, or something called the Western Pacific subtropical high, persisted over China, part of China, for a longer period of time. So the consequences, the results is extreme extended period of heat dreams, extreme high temperatures, and consequently, people, society, the economy all have to bear the consequences at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, in the European countries, we heard of this extreme, also very high temperature in many countries, and then the drought. How challenging is the situation?
I think the situation here is very challenging. It's no less serious than there in China, because here in Europe, rivers are literally drying up, and that means that transportation of goods are going to be curtailed. The drought means that agriculture is being profoundly affected. Precious water resources are being diverted to cool livestock and to sustain crops. Because of the war in Ukraine, despite the agreement reached in Istanbul, grain and other commodities are not yet flowing freely. And given the uncertainties of war, Xinhua, there's no guarantee about what tomorrow or next week or next month or next year is going to bring. Personally, I worry about the winter and how many people are going to die from the cold, because there's a reasonable prediction that there will be a strong cold-inducing La Nina here, making for a colder than usual winter. And if you want to talk about a perfect storm, you can add to this a witch's brew of the prospect of renewed COVID, as there are new strains of it circulating here from India, South Africa, and elsewhere. It's really unknown how severe they might be. But when you couple COVID fatigue with high food and energy costs and the drought, that means political instability and the prospect of real civil unrest and changes of governments ill-equipped to deal with this perfect storm.
Well, serious challenges ahead. Charles, if you look at the economic impact and also people's livelihood, high temperatures in Sichuan have caused shutdowns of factories, to ease power demands. Some people would say, the shutdowns might push up the cost of lithium, which is a key component of electric car batteries, and may even cause a global supply chain disruption, because China is a leading country in lithium processing and Sichuan is the country's lithium mining hub. So how worried should we be?
I think our worries should be much broader than just lithium. The supply chain of many, many products, as Harvey has just said, including food, is going to be really, really seriously disrupted. Lithium is one metal it's very important for new and renewable energies, vehicles, electric vehicles. But there are other supply sources of lithium, such as South America and Australia. But the shortage of electricity, because of reduction of power generation from hydropower, is going to be more impactful on the daily lives of people and businesses. And that's what we see happening in Sichuan, because Sichuan produces or exports about 1/4 of its power generation to the rest of the country, especially to the coastal region. I think that in and of itself is going to seriously impact the economy, especially in manufacturing, in also the average life of people. Of course, it's not as serious as what is going on in Europe, because not only do you not have hydropower anymore, you also don't have gas-fired power because of the sanctions against Russia. Companies that I know in Germany, for example, that has futures contract on electricity that produces aluminium, is basically selling futures contract to make a profit on electricity and not producing aluminium anymore. So I think the disruption overall to the global economy is massive. But ultimately, I think Harvey's point, his concluding point, is the most significant. What will happen is there will be increased disparity between the rich and the poor, rich countries and poor countries, and the rich and poor in the same country. You're going to have social unrest, and the global south, which is the least capable of being able to handle these things, will end up bearing the most burden.
Mm-hmm. Well, Changhua, of course, because of the climate change, you have these extreme weathers, and at the same time, you see the responses from the governments around the world. For example, in China, because of the reduced hydropower production, probably China will be forced to rely more on coal production, on coal-fired plants. Similarly, in some European countries, because of their own challenges, some of them are back on coal. So that probably will somehow produce more, say, frustration in terms of meeting their climate change commitment.
Rising coal or return of coal has already been happening, and last year already globally we witnessed the strong growth of coal in the power sector, in particular, pretty much in major economies, developed and developing countries. As a consequence, greenhouse gas emissions definitely been shooting up. And this year, as I mentioned, exacerbated by the heat waves and throughout the world at this moment, coal is definitely coming back. We don't know that number yet. We'll see, fingers crossed. But very, possibly, coal definitely is going to be a major coming back against the backdrop of global effort to fight climate change. And we have to, just imagining. With more emissions and more extreme weather events will come along, and heat waves, droughts, floods, you name it, we've been living in it, will continue to intensify. And we're going to have bear more and more like heatflations or, your extreme weather events, shutdowns, impacting people's health and impacting our infrastructure, our economy, our jobs, everything. As Harvey and Charles have been mentioning, the social impact will be huge. That's a major concern in terms of further division, among people, and conflicts and violence will be definitely, already rising, will continue to rise. And that's going to be very worrying situation or trend for the global community.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, in European countries, as we mentioned, there could be possibly this. Severest drought in 500 years, and also you talked about the cold winter, the shortage of energy, in particular gas. So what are the countries doing in response, or preparing for the worst challenges probably in many years?
I think part of the main thing that they're doing is praying for a warm winter, but obviously that's not enough. So actually, a lot of the countries are trying to stock up on energy supplies, including coal, oil, and gas. And for example, even before the coal ban, EU's coal ban came into effect last week, they've been buying coal and other energy resources from Russia itself. So they really need it. Their supplies are getting replenished, but they're not anywhere near 100%. So part of it depends on how bad the winter is going to be this year, and part of it depends about also on how much companies and businesses and individuals can lower their temperatures, and if that's going to raise their emotional temperatures and play into what we all talked about, and that is the social instability. So I think you could summarize it by saying that Europe is hoping for the best, but kind of preparing for the worst.
Mm-hmm. Well, is that possible? If you look at, when we talk about the coldest winter, of course, in the gas shortage, we say, we assume that Russia will basically shut down or export or really reduce export to a minimal level to European countries. But that would mean, the income for Russia revenue would be reduced also sharply. Is there a chance, for the two sides maybe they talk to each other, resumption of the supply of gas to normal level, for example?
Well, one would hope so, but I think the experience so far has been contrary to that, because we slapped, or the West, I didn't do it, the West slapped all these sanctions on Russia with the hope of bringing it to its knees and crippling it economically. But what's happened is that Russia has gotten a huge windfall because of the relative scarcity of energy. Their prices have gone way up, and their treasury is really full to overflowing now, so much that they can finance the war and still have a surplus. So I'm not sure that this is going to be a motivator for bringing the parties together. But frankly, Xinhua, I'm not at all hopeful. I think this could go into next year and beyond.
Next year and beyond. So Charles, given the situation, okay, the war will continue for some time to come, and also the climate change, extreme weather is becoming more and more frequent. Economically, what we can do to alleviate probably the effects?
I think ultimately the world has to come together on this, but unfortunately, as Harvey, I am not very optimistic about that, because the geopolitical jockeying for position has become so absurd. It reaches a point where if you look at the European government, I don't see statesmen stepping forward and dealing with the sanctions against Russia, for example, which is bringing its people to their knees in terms of survival. But European governments went ahead with sanctions. I just cannot believe that they could not have considered the possibility of this blockage of energy sources to Europe. So I don't see the possibility, as Harvey, to see that this will be addressed between the two sides anytime soon. Now, in terms of where this economy will go, I see Europe tanking, collapsing. Big German companies are about to lay off tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of workers. And European economy is already into a recession. Inflation in the UK has gone over 10%. And the US economy is also not doing that much better. So in China, I should just add a very important facet is that in terms of food, more than 50% of the global reserve, strategic reserve of food, are in China. The Chinese government, at least, has taken the pains of accumulating grain reserves so as to be able to address exactly this type of issues which are beginning to surface. And Europeans are now asking the Chinese to release some of their strategic reserves. But I think the Chinese government will probably release some for the global south before they give it to the Europeans.
Well, thank you, Chenghua, Harvey, and Charles. Well, let's move on to India, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi has pledged to raise millions out of poverty and transform India into a developed country in the next 25 years, in time for the nation to celebrate its 100 years of independence from British rule. How realistic is the goal, and what challenges and opportunities lie ahead? For this part, we'll also be joined by Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chairman of Manipur Advanced Research Group. Welcome to the show, Professor. Well, thank you for joining us. But here is a question. According to the World Bank, India's per capita GDP is about $2,300 in 2021, making it a lower middle-income economy. But based on the current threshold of developed economies, the figure is about more than 20,000. So people would ask, how realistic is the goal, is the grand vision of Prime Minister Modi?
This is the grand vision, not only of Prime Minister Modi, but of 1.38 billion Indians. The reality is that from the 1980s onwards, throughout the 1990s, China had a huge and powerful tailwind that the people of China, the government of China took advantage of. And today, China is the second superpower after the United States. We believe that our time has come now, that the tailwind is now with India. And we have a young population. We have a population that's getting in its tens of millions educated in technology and in various other fields of knowledge. And we believe that this is it can be transformational. At the same time, the overall geopolitical environment is becoming more favorable to India. So we believe that India's time has come. And Prime Minister Modi comes from the people. He comes from a very humble background. So he is reflecting the hopes of these, billions and billions of people who believe that after all these years of 75 years now, this is the 75th year of our freedom. We believe that finally India's time has come, and that the next years ahead, the next generation, the next 25 years will be years of increasing prosperity. You remember what China was in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and what China is today. So we are seeing the same transformation that we believe will occur in India, and India will, after China, be the next superpower.
Well, thank you, Professor. Harvey, as Professor Nalapat said, India is looking at China, say India's time has come, would become another China, to become one of the superpowers economically, to say the least. And also the country has a young population, has some strength. What do you make of this grand vision?
I think it's a grand vision, but I'm not sure that there's much substance behind it yet. And I don't think there are many details behind it. So I wonder if the Indian country is going to be able to repeat what China did. China lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. That's the largest uplift economically of any group in world history. But China had a lot more going for itself in terms of its governance style, in terms of how they opened up the economy, especially after the reform and opening up. But India, I believe, faces very severe challenges in this respect.
Mm-hmm. Well, Charles, Professor Nalapat mentioned another very interesting point about geopolitical situation. We can see that India is a friend to the West, the US, European countries, Russia, and with China, they are having a not that bad relationship either, Japan. So that's a strength for India to attract, either transfer of technology or investment from other countries.
I've tried to do investments in India, and I have to say my specific personal experience has not been very positive. China's opening up, for example. You go to any governor of any province, you wanted a project done. As long as it promotes economic development, you get it done. And the government will provide policies to support you. But the experience I had in India was much more difficult. Building a railway, for example, and financing a transport system meant going through a number of territories and you have to get approval in each and single one. And it was very, very complicated. And the geopolitics is this. Of course, Prime Minister Modi has been very, very adroit in being able to manipulate between the different sides, Russia, US, and China. But that is only for short-term gain. I don't see a long-term strategic focus on bringing the country out of poverty in joining the global south, as we call it. Because what we had was a very special situation in the last 30 years. The globalization process came at a time when China was just about ripe for development, and participation in a very tight way into the globalization process benefited China. But I think there is deglobalization going on in the global supply chain, and that's not going to be very, very helpful, the external circumstances in India's case. So I think, for example, for domestic reasons, domestic political reasons, India didn't join RCEP, which they really should have. But in order to protect their domestic industry or domestic companies, they refused to join the largest economic bloc, ASEAN countries and China and Japan and Korea. So for domestic political reasons, they're not participating in what could be a major boost for their economy. So I think there are domestic issues which India has to address. Of course, to have a very large youthful population with a lot of energy and so on is certainly a big benefit to the country, like China had 30 years ago. But the issue here is, as Harvey said, education level is lacking. Number two is employment opportunities is also a serious issue. Number three, the polarization in the society, more than the simple issue of religion. What about the caste system, which has left a very deep imprint in this psyche of the society as a whole? If you don't let the youth and women, in effect, have equal status to be able to climb the social ladder in a fair way, you end up with a lot of social instability, which will also hinder your further economic development. But ultimately, I think the most important is in China's case, we had a very strong central government that basically had a very clear strategy in where to take the country and the population. Mm-hmm. And that is lacking in India today.
Mm-hmm. Professor Nalapat, we mentioned about the geopolitical situation. People would say yes, India is in the advantageous position, enjoying relationship with most of the major powers, attracting investment, transfer of technology. But then here's a question: people, some, including from the West, they criticize India's business environment. They say, there are several incidents people could talk of, like for rejecting foreign investment in India. This India enjoys the reputation of an investment black hole or a country of tax terrorism. Are such accusations justifiable? What challenges in terms of attracting investment? What does India need to do?
Well, I'd like to say that a major problem has been the problem of corruption, and Prime Minister Modi raised this front and center in his speech on the 75th anniversary of our independence, just on 15th of August. And the problem with corrupt officials is they create problems entirely in order to extort bribes. Now, there are fortunately a lesser and lesser number of these people, and it's true that that problem has been there. But the good news is there's much more transparency. If you have a smartphone, you can record an official asking for a bribe, and that official is going to land into serious trouble. The good news is that about 700 million people in India have now got access to the internet. And I would say that 900 million in about 3 or 4 years' time are going to get access. Prime Minister Modi made Digital India a priority from the very first week that he took over power in 2014. And the good news about digitalization, it is transparency. You can expose this kind of evil activity. And every day we get news of some corrupt official or the other getting exposed and being made to pay the price. Because once it goes live on the internet, you cannot hold it back. And that is a very good plus. Secondly, people are becoming more aware of their rights. Because of their access to the internet, they are getting information about their rights. They're also getting information how to improve their lives, whether they're in agriculture or whether they're in other fields. Vocational training has become very important. Now, for the first time, we have degrees, bachelor's degrees, advanced degrees in vocations. We never saw vocations as important in the past. Now, it is very important. So overall, there is a transformation taking place. And Narendra Modi, who comes from the people, who owes his success to the people, he is in a sense the face of that transformation and also to an extent the driving force behind that. But the most important driving force is the young people of India. And we are the youngest population in the world, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of trained, educated young people.
One more question about the goal of raising 270 million people living extreme poverty, out of poverty, let's say. And, what's the plan to do that, to achieve that goal? And what are the challenges ahead?
There is a scheme now introduced by this government, which essentially ensures that everybody has an adequate supply of food to eat. So literally 150, 200 million people have been fed every day through this scheme. At the same time, there's now a scheme of providing health care to people. And more importantly, that's a certain amount of money. It is 500,000 Indian rupees. Now, that may not seem like a lot in some countries. It's a lot in India. Remember, in purchasing power parity terms, we are already a 10 trillion economy. So the fact of the matter is that technology is working as a great friend of a cleaner society, a more transparent society, and very important, a society that can empower everybody, because our talent is there in every level of society. And if you develop the talent in the underprivileged sections, if you bring them up to a higher level through technology, as for example, provision of smartphones, provision of internet access, then the country can leapfrog into growth. China has shown the way, quite frankly. China has shown the way in this. And we believe that we can follow the example of China, because like China, India and China are two huge and ancient civilizations.
Well, on that note, we concluded today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.